All right, so Max and I are here talking about the audit event webhooks epic and some questions that are on the issue. Figured it'd be more efficient to just quickly sync up, go through it rather than try and do it async. All right, so let me pull it up. How do you want to go through these, Max? Do you want to do like a screen share? You want to just talk through them top to bottom?
Yeah, I'll share my screen. Let me just get the issue back up because I've closed it. So yeah, where's it gone? There we go. Share screen. Okay. So I've gone through, created sort of three broad of the iterations threads. I just want to make sure that I'm kind of barking up the right tree, as it were. So the first, the 0th iteration, I really like this idea. I think it will be focusing mostly on how the mechanism of picking and choosing which audit events we send to a new place. So I think it's more of a UX issue than a back-end engineering one, because we've already got the hard work is done in terms of recording audit events. You know, we do that now, and it works fairly well. But this will be an instance of choosing, okay, I want all instance events or this event, but not that event, to be sent to place X. My initial thought is place X should just be a new log file. So filtered logs.log or something like that. My only worry is that's quite simplistic. I don't know if it's good enough or whether it proves what you want to prove in an initial
Yeah,
MVC.
so maybe I can talk about kind of the high level goals for iteration 0 and 1 and 2. Because just to be clear, that's a proposal for iterations. If they don't make sense, we can change them, remove them, whatever is needed there. Really what I was thinking on iteration 0, our goals are for not necessarily to ship something external to customers unless they're just really savvy to try brand new things, but really to prove to ourselves that we can do this concept of streaming events to a new location as they occur, as well as the selection and subsetting of events. I realize those are two different use cases, so if we need to split that into two different threads, fine.
Okay. I mean, yeah, in terms
iteration
of like
1 would be where we would want to actually put something customer facing out. You know, that would be the MVC rather than just the MC, if you will.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, in terms of streaming in that sentence, it kind of works. We kind of already have a streaming system in the sense of, you know, when an audit event happens, it gets sent somewhere, in our case, a database and a log file. So we kind of already have streaming in that sense. The streaming thing we're missing is it going into what you might consider a traditional streaming solution. So like Kafka or S3 or Kinesis or whatever service, or even Splunk.
Right.
So I think the only thing that we don't have in that initial iteration is that filtering, I want X, Y, and Z. But then for iteration 1 and 2, where we're starting to send that data to new places, I'm wondering what value filtering has. They're kind of two separate problems. One that we could even apply now, which is, you know, don't save audit events for a particular action, for example. That feels like almost a completely separate problem that we could still solve. Whereas the one we're trying to assess is, I want to send audit events of all types to 6 different places, for example.
Right. Well, do you think it would make sense to split iteration 1 into 2 different pieces then? One to focus on just the send it to a non-GitLab destination, and the other one into a do the subsetting?
Possibly, yeah. Because there's nothing to say, like the first iteration for the filtering could apply to our existing audit event system. You know, let's say, oh, actually, I don't want to store authentication events, or I don't want to store when someone from the public downloads my repository. You know, that can be entirely separate from any new audit event system, and it would probably sit quite nicely with what we already have.
Yeah, and one detail just to make sure it's called out as well, is the subsetting would only apply to these events that are sent elsewhere. We would
Okay.
still have the classic audit events, as I called them, always being written to GitLab for the most critical, most security sensitive event types. Because on that prioritization list, I really see all of those remaining inside of GitLab and going external. The only ones that we would want to allow users to disable would be some of those more high volume event streams, like individual Git commits, that type of thing, which would not be in the classic audit event system.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. Okay, so there is a slight difference there in that our existing system will always record no matter what choices an administrator makes. Okay, that's fine. In which case, yeah, we probably wouldn't.
Yeah, I put some stuff in the overarching epic under the classic audit events. So I'll drop a link in our Zoom chat there if you want to check that out afterwards as well.
Yeah, that's true. So in which case, yeah, I think this first iteration's interesting and worth doing because it allows us to create the foundation for sending logs to a different place and sending specific logs to a different place. In which case, I guess my other question is, what is the product value in filtering those logs? Do you see a reason why a customer will say, hey, we want to send logs to Splunk, but we only want to send these events to Splunk? Is there strong value there, do you think?
Let me open up my balsamic drawing where I had tried to work through some of this, and I'll get your feedback.
Okay.
All right. Can you see that?
Yeah.
All right. So really the user benefits from this would be they have more control over what they consider important. Filtering reduces noise, and it also makes the interfacing better. So they wouldn't have to write some sort of filtering mechanism on their own. If they could just tick off and say, I only want to send all the I don't know, like Git events to this endpoint, send all the user events to this other endpoint, rather than send everything to multiple endpoints, have multiple filters on those endpoints.
Okay, so a future iteration you see is the idea that A, B, and C would be sent to one place and C, D, and E would be sent to another place potentially.
Correct.
Okay,
yeah, so
cool.
like on this screen, iteration 2, where we provide the ability to do multiple endpoint types like S3, Google Cloud, whatever. Yep. I would envision this being, copy the form multiple times.
Yep, I'm with you. Okay, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. Okay. Let me go back to sharing my screen again. Okay, so that, yeah, for the 0th iteration, that makes sense to me, and I think it's achievable, within a milestone. The idea that we can add those filters, maybe just for self-managed customers, like at an instance level, so we can test it on GitLab.com, or would you see this being across groups and instances, or just projects, for example?
All of it, yeah. Because really with our SaaS first product principle, we really want to start everything from day one at the self-managed and the .com user use cases. If that means, it takes longer, that's understood. Of the relative priority between these two use cases, though, I would say filtering is less important than the initial send it to a new location sort of use case.
Yeah. I think
users can't get the data, filtering provides no value. So it's that we need to get them something first, right?
Yeah, I think the writing it to, in this case, a new file, I think is very, very trivial in the sense that we already write to a file. So what we'd be adding is write to another file. The difficulty is, well, not difficulty, the complexity is write these particular things to a file, ignoring these other things. That's fine, like we can totally do that, but that's where the logic is. The actual writing to a file bit, that's the easy bit. But yeah, that's totally doable. And I think, we would just write everything to this log file that is already written to a log file now. So that's not too tricky. Yeah, I definitely think that's achievable in some form within a single milestone.
Okay. Would pivoting that to a webhook-based approach in iteration 1 be a big jump, do you think? Like if we already write to a file today, and I assume you're talking about the database, like, do we even need to prove out that we can do that from a technical perspective?
Not really. We already write to a file. Everything that's written to the database is also written to a structured text log file for self-managed users. So yeah, like I say, the complexity in this first one is the filtering. The writing is the easy bit, and it gets more complicated when we end up into the first iteration where we're dealing with webhooks.
Got it. Well, that was one of the things I was hoping to get out of iteration 0 as well, is are webhooks harder than writing to a file?
Yeah, I mean, yes, they are, in the sense of writing to a file is a pretty quick operation, especially if it's a local file, because it's open the file, write stuff to file, close to file. That's it. Whereas webhooks is send a payload, make sure the payload was sent, make sure the thing on the other end was listening. Do we wait for them to respond? Do we need to deal with authentication or encryption or signing or all those kinds of things? And that gets more complicated then. That's why I don't know whether HTTP-based webhooks are potentially the best first iteration. They're the most generic and probably give us the most power. But if we were to use some sort of managed service in the first iteration, for example, writing to S3 feels like or some other object block storage anyway, would feel like less work for us, because those client libraries already exist. We'd be saying we want to write to S3 bucket A, and then we wouldn't need to deal with authentication or authorization or encryption or signing.
We could just use all of their infrastructure and what they've already built there instead.
Yeah, there's a lot of very sensibly set up defaults there. We would need to provide a GitLab administrator or a group administrator the ability to set the AWS authentication, so secret key, region,
Right.
bucket name, all that kind of stuff. But then all the authentication is handled outside of GitLab, as opposed to an HTTP endpoint where there's so many potential, failure cases, and we'd need to account for all of those.
Got it. Well, it sounds like you think we should pivot then to using that as our iteration 1 approach rather than the general just HTTP webhook then?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I'm having these thoughts out loud as I'm talking to you, but yes, that does seem sensible. I think it would reduce the scope of what we need to do. S3s are still, or S3, or because I know we use quite a lot of Google Cloud, so that equivalent, I don't know what it's called. It gives us quite a lot of sensible defaults.
Google Cloud Storage.
Catchy name. That allows us, it gives us a lot of sensible defaults. I'd be very surprised if those Ruby gems weren't already installed in GitLab. And if they're not, it's not a lot of work to add them. I assume they're MIT licensed. So yeah, that might be a more sensible first sort of streaming adapter to build, perhaps, because it's still pretty generic. You can write anything to a bucket, can't you? So if we're just writing a text file with structured text in it, that seems like a good idea.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be open to exploring that then. Because actually in iteration 2, that's where I was hoping we would eventually get to, is having like S3 GCP as sort of that like destination endpoint type. I had just assumed that general HTTP webhooks were easier for us to do. So if you want to look into the S3 and the GCS stuff a bit more, I'm happy if we want to update the iteration to do that first instead.
Yeah, I think it sounds like a sensible thing. Let me look into a bit more, because there might be an obvious reason why it's not a sensible thing to do first. But yeah, in my head, like an S3 one or a GCP adapter would just be creating a file with that structured text in it that we already create for audit events, and then writing that file to S3.
Well, and there's a lot of services out there that can actually do compliance based on what you point at S3. Like
yeah,
they know how to read S3. They don't know necessarily how to read generic GitLab communication.
exactly. And I know
I
there's
see us
some
ending up in
really,
that sort of object storage eventually anyways.
yeah, there's a lot of AWS services. I'm not quite as familiar with Google Cloud that provide like will constantly scan S3 buckets for like secrets and potentially anomalous looking things. That could potentially be really interesting. Okay, leave that with me, and I can have a look in that in a bit more detail, and maybe we can shift around the iterations.
Cool. Just to make sure, because I do have a hard stop at 10.
Yeah,
I'm talking to some guy who wants to break into product management, so just looking for some networking kind of help there. Let's go ahead and kind of summarize what we discussed in the issue so we don't have to rewatch the recording.
sure.
So takeaways, so filtering and webhook approach are separate use cases. Put those into different issues.
Yeah, but I think our first thing we should do would be to add that ability to filter, because that will feed into anything else we want to do.
HTTPS webhook are probably more difficult than S3 GCS object storage. And open iteration to these others first. That's where we want to go. Anyways, I really wish the N key on my keyboard was not broken. You don't realize how many words have the letter N until you can't use it. If you ever see me making typos, that's probably why.
That's why you're just going to start mashing M randomly in.
Well, I get myself into the habit of trying to like rephrase things so I don't have to deal with my keyboard.
You need to buy a new keyboard, Sam.
Well, I have a new keyboard, but I've got like one of these guys,
Oh, okay, so that takes time.
Yeah, but the mouse is on my laptop, so I have to like keep going back and forth between them, and it's like, well, I'm already on the mouse. I'll just use the laptop keyboard,
Smooth. Okay, so yeah, I think the first like user-facing iteration then will be GCS or S3. Probably S3 would be a good proof of concept.
Are these the main two things that we took away then?
Yes. If you comment that there, I can flesh them out into something a bit clearer, and I'll move my comments from what I'll rename iteration 1 and 2 and switch them around.
Cool. All right. Any of your other questions we didn't hit? Oh, we should probably note the distinction between self-managed and SaaS as really being the goal.
Yeah. That's fine, because that would have been my default, really, had I thought about it. Had I not thought about it, so that's important.
Yeah. In general, that's just how GitLab wants us to start thinking is, I don't know if you saw a comment on Noob asked me, but he even asked me, did I get permission from Sid to do an instance feature? Which,
right, okay.
I don't know if that's a new
this
thing, but that's kind of the mindset we should be in. Like, why am I doing this at the instance? How can I redo this at the group or workspace or project level?
Got you. That's fine. Yeah, but we can do that. And for the very first iteration, that's not going to be a problem either, because we're just going to send whatever we already send to audit logs. Okay, fantastic.
All right. Yeah, this was awesome, Max. I think we got a lot done in 15, 20 minutes or so.
Definitely.
Versus trying to go back and forth writing books of text on the issue,
Yeah.
right?
All right.
All right.
Fantastic. I
Let's
will.